should react to the Vox video on Venezuela. Oh, I know exactly what video you're talking about. Let's do it. Yes, let's react to that Vox video on Venezuela. I've been meaning to do that forever, dude. Okay. Here we go. Let me see how long it is, because I don't remember it being that long. 7 minutes 31. Yeah, we can do this. This is perfect. So this is a ridiculous video from Vox, very liberal-ish outlet. And this video is, I want to go in depth on it because I've been meaning to talk about this for a while. I think I actually wrote a response to this video and then just never filmed it, which is common. I love writing, don't necessarily love filming myself all the time.
Yo estos meses todo el tiempo de marcha por mi familia, por la comida, por el pueblo.
Siempre voy a estar en las calles luchando por la libertad de mis hijos. Y bueno.
So right away, those protesters are trying to make you feel sympathetic for. Exact same thing as the Cuban protesters in the video we just watched, who were not only funded by the U.S. State Department, but were extremely right-wing and are advocating for essentially the implementation of neoliberalism in their country, and with the explicit purpose of making themselves look like they're anti-government for Western audiences, for making Western audiences think that the population of Venezuela wants to overthrow their government, making Western audiences think that Venezuelan people don't understand that a lot of their struggles come from the U.S. economic blockade. If you watch, there's a great Abby Martin video where she goes to Venezuela and she goes on the ground and follows just opposition protesters, these people the Western media is trying to make sympathetic, and she shows how they do things. And essentially they damage stuff, they cause a commotion until the police come out, they try and get the police to do something, to launch tear gas or something to scare them away, and then they run away and they film it, and then the U.S. media boosts it like crazy and says, look at these human rights abuses whenever they're trying to cook up regime change propaganda against Venezuela. And in 2017 was during the conservative kind of backlash against the pink tide, the rise of the left-wing leaders in Venezuela. So at this time, the U.S. was funneling millions of dollars into the right-wing Venezuelan opposition party and trying to create a color revolution in Venezuela, very similar to what they're doing now in Cuba. Things have laid off Venezuela a little bit as the U.S.'s color revolution and coup attempts have been extremely laughably unsuccessful. But in 2017, when this video was published, it was heating up, and there was some conservative momentum on the ground that the U.S. was doing everything they could to prop up and try and turn into actual regime change.
La violencia del gobierno y la violencia del AMPA. Todo eso son razones para tú salir a protestar, a manifestar, a defender tus derechos y a aspirar a una mejor Venezuela.
It's worth pointing out, too, in these Latin American countries where the indigenous populations have had long histories of being exploited by Europeans, a lot of times the right-wing protesters that are popping up on Western media are white. And you notice that the left-wing protesters standing with the revolutionary movement, standing with the government, are indigenous people or people of color, and the people rising to the top of these movements like Maduro, Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Pedro Castillo are from indigenous communities, are indigenous themselves. That's another aspect that's always at play here, and you always notice that the protesters Western media is propping up tend to be whiter and wealthier.
Venezuela was once the richest country in Latin America. It has the largest known oil reserves in the world, and its democratic government was once praised worldwide. But today, Venezuela's democratic institutions...
There's so much to stop and analyze here. It's crazy. The times that they're talking about here when democracy in Venezuela was so great, throughout the 90s, or the last century, the country was run by a series of dictators, Western-backed dictators, and all of their oil revenue was going to Rockefeller Standard Oil and British Dutch Shell, which left their economy in a situation where they were dependent on oil, and their people were essentially working as borderline slaves for the enrichment of Western multinational oil corporations. So this is what Vox props up as successful democracy in Venezuela, the time when Venezuela was being most exploited, the time when the U.S. was extracting their resources the most. Just a few years just a few years before this, Richard Nixon went to Venezuela before he was president on behalf of the U.S. government to make good relations, and the people tried to kill him. They tried to destroy Richard Nixon's motorcade. We can look it up. Venezuelan people, Richard Nixon, because these people understand that their resources and their oil are being extracted by Western multinationals, and they understand that Richard Nixon and the U.S. State Department works at the behest of those multinationals. So they attacked him and tried to kill him, right? This is the thriving democracy of Venezuela that the U.S. propped up that Vox is still praising today. What an absolute joke.
But today, Venezuela's democratic institutions and its economy are in shambles. The country has the highest inflation rate in the world, making food and medicine inaccessible to most Venezuelans. Over the last 4 years, its GDP has fallen 35%, which is a sharper drop than the one seen during the Great Depression.
And these coincide here, these graphs, and I go in depth on this in my thesis, they coincide with both an increase in sanctions that happened in 2016, 2017, and a plummet in global oil prices, which was manufactured by the U.S. and manufactured by OPEC countries. Hugo Chavez used to travel around to other oil-producing countries, and he would try and stabilize the supply of oil so that the Venezuelan oil could still be sold for a lot of currency on the global market, which could then be used to reinvest in working people. But the global price of oil went very unfavorably to Venezuela, and this is what's used. And Maduro went ahead with this like dual currency policy that was supposed to combat it. It was pretty unsuccessful, and that is what's blamed as the reason for Venezuela's hyperinflation and for the poverty and the starvation that they've seen. When the U.S. has increased sanctions to now there are over 160 sanctions targeting Venezuelans' oil industry that for years was having their oil extracted by British Dutch Shell and Rockefeller Standard Oil, leaving the country dependent on oil. And then we point and say, oh, Maduro doesn't understand economics because he's a socialist and he's purposefully starving his people, and that's why these bad things are happening. Not telling the full truth, of course, but if you want to look at more of the economic specifics of what happened in 2016 when this hyperinflation started happening and Venezuela saw a downturn, check out my thesis on Midwestern Marx. It's called Neocolonialism and the Western Media Response in Venezuela, or something like that.
In the U.S., and the country's murder rate has surpassed that of the most dangerous cities in the world. These conditions have sparked months of protests against the president, Nicolas Maduro, and it's easy to see why. The country has become measurably worse since his election in 2013. A poll.
So do they support Hugo Chavez? So do they think Hugo Chavez's form of socialism was good and then just Maduro got in power? And this is what I'm talking about with these graphs you always see. They'll put Maduro's election in 2013 like I was saying they were going to do. I predicted the propaganda point they were going to use. They say Maduro was elected in this time, and then that's when everything went down, right after Maduro. Have no mention of the massive increase in sanctions and no mention of the declining oil prices and no mention of the fact that Venezuela's industry is dependent on oil due to years of neocolonialism from Western multinationals. Don't even mention that. Just say Maduro got elected. I mean, think about this. What does this even explain about the economy, right? This is such a basic misunderstanding. You wouldn't just say, you know, the president got in power and then this is what happened to the economy. Like, you have to explain specifics. You can't just say Maduro elected, inflation went up, end of story. But that's how liberals tell history, right? They'll give you one fact, whether there's a correlation or not, and then they try and blame everything bad on socialism generally.
Showed that about 80% of Venezuelans want Maduro removed from office. But instead, the opposite has happened.
I don't know where this statistic is from. 2016 DAT analysis. This is not true. Maduro has won Venezuela's elections fairly easily, and there are critiques of him. There are lots of critiques of him from within the Venezuelan Communist Party and from within the Venezuelan left wing especially. Check out the website Venezuela Analysis if you want to see that. But Juan Guaido, the opposition leader in Venezuela, has something like 10% approval. The U.S. has never been able to get Juan Guaido, their preferred opposition leader, to get the approval among the Venezuelan people that would be needed to actually get him to win an election against Maduro, even with millions of dollars in funding. And I can look this up. U.S. funding to Venezuelan opposition party. And Joe Biden has recently talked about not funding this person anymore, not funding Juan Guaido because of his lack of support. So somehow Biden wants to give up on his regime change puppet because he doesn't have any support, yet 80% of people want to remove Maduro and replace him with this guy who's getting $15 million from the CIA. Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know what statistics I could bring up right now to show this is nonsense. But I would check out Venezuela analysis of their election that happened around 2016, or of their most recent election, where they had multiple international observers on the ground, basically filming and reporting live every minute detail that happened with the Venezuelan election so that the U.S. couldn't lie about it. And Maduro won easily, even though he had a small block of voters, because people are very critical of him. There was essentially no even opposition. People didn't even vote for the opposition party. They decided not to run to make it look like the elections were more of a fraud than they actually were. But Maduro has full support, even though people are very critical of him. This is a completely nonsensical statistic that I'm sure you could spend 5 minutes refuting if you dug into it a bit.
Maduro has consolidated his power, bringing the country closer to authoritarian rule. Maduro's political ambition became evident in December 2015. 2 years after he became president, a coalition of opposition parties called the Democratic Unity Roundtable, or MUD, won a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly.
Maduro's political ambition started when he was a bus driver, and he rose up through the trade unions and then was elected to power after Hugo. I can't remember if he was elected or appointed, but he was elected later. He became very popular as a working class leader in the trade unions and then took over after Chavez died of a heart attack. So his political ambitions didn't start in 2015.
Putting Maduro's rule at risk. In response, Maduro quickly forced out several Supreme Court justices and filled the positions with cronies loyal to him.
What was actually happening were a few members of the Venezuelan National Assembly who won election in 2015, despite the fact that Venezuela is apparently a dictatorship that has never had fair elections, and Maduro simply appoints the National Assembly. Somehow, despite that, the right-wing party won National Assembly election, and then it was found that a few of their members were planning a violent coup to overthrow the government with the backing of the CIA. So there was a trial done, and they were put in jail, and then U.S. Western media, corporate outlets like Vox, started blasting this as, oh, Venezuela threw their politicians in jail. Isn't Maduro a dictator? They were trying to destroy the country. They were working with a foreign power to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Do you know what would happen in the United States if somebody in the government was working with someone in a foreign government to try and create a coup, to try and destabilize the U.S. government and overthrow it? They would be put in jail. They would be worse than put in jail. This is not an example of Venezuela being authoritarian, and the way that they're portraying this event is so ridiculous.
In March 2016, the court ruled to strip the opposition-led National Assembly of its powers, a move that sparked massive protests across the country. The ruling was reversed a few days later, but the damage was done. Protests continued to grow and have left about 100 dead and thousands injured so far. Despite the violence and public outcry, Maduro held a vote in July.
100 dead and thousands injured. That's what they give on those protests. They don't mention which side the protesters are that are killed. They just said these protests happened and this many people died and are injured. There is a study showing that 40,000 people by 2017 had been killed by the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. 40,000 people. But of course, the liberal media like Vox is more concerned with the 100 protesters who died trying to overthrow this guy with the backing of the CIA than they are about the 40,000 people who were starved to death by sanctions from the U.S. prior to this time. Is that not authoritarian? Is that not dictatorial? Of course it's not, because anything that liberal Western democracies do is good, according to Vox and the rest of liberal corporate media.
to elect a new governing body called the National Constituent Assembly, which would have the power to rewrite Venezuela's constitution and essentially replace the National Assembly and leave virtually no opposition to Maduro's rule.
Bueno, por el bienestar del país.
¿Qué está buscando en esta nueva Asamblea Nacional Constituyente?
Bueno, una paz para todos.
Notice how this guy can't even say what they want, which was the thing with the National Assembly. When the right-wing opposition party won the National Assembly election in Venezuela, people who voted for them, who fell into this conservative backlash, who did blame a lot of the country's problems on Maduro and the government due to left-wing propaganda, and Western propaganda. And Venezuela is not like Cuba. Most of their media institutions in Venezuela are privately owned, can be funneled money by the U.S. But look and people realized the National Assembly wasn't doing anything after a few years of them being in charge, other than trying to destabilize the government further, right? They weren't actually trying to stabilize things and get around the blockade. They were just trying to help the U.S. in their regime change efforts using the blockade. But look at what they call for from the Venezuelan opposition, right? This is like a right-wing Venezuelan guy who supports the right-wing opposition. He wants peace for everyone. He shrugged his shoulders like, I don't know, peace for everyone. How is peace for everyone going to get around the 166 sanctions on your most vital industry that's used to fund social programs that allow the working class to go to school and not starve? What does peace for everyone mean, right? And this is the case with all these color revolutions, all these right-wing protests for freedom and democracy against authoritarianism backed up by the U.S. It's always, we want peace and we don't want to be authoritarian. Okay, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean anything at all. I feel like you just want the right-wing people in power who are going to do what the bourgeoisie wants.
With Maduro's recent vote, Venezuelans didn't have a say in whether the assembly should exist. They only had the option to elect its members. But when Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, proposed a constitutional rewrite in 1999, he first called for a referendum to propose the election of the assembly. After most Venezuelans voted yes, they then elected a new National Constituent Assembly. See, unlike Maduro,
and they don't talk at all about the legacy of colonialism that created that constitution. And this is something that happens again when all the pink tide leaders have taken power, and you're seeing the same thing with Pedro Castillo now in Peru. One of the first things they have to do is change the constitution, because the years of colonialism, when Vox was calling Venezuela a wonderful, thriving democracy, they wrote racist and exploitative constitutions that left the indigenous people of Venezuela as second-class citizens until these indigenous leaders like Hugo Chavez could take power. And now they're about to praise Hugo Chavez here a little bit, but they didn't bring that up when talking about the Constitution, and that's a vital point. And it's a vital point they leave out because they don't want to prop up these Venezuelan socialist leaders as being successful. But they might give some props to Chavez here. We will see what they say.
Chavez was a charismatic and beloved leader. In the 90s, he burst onto television sets across the country. He blamed government corruption and Venezuela's elite for the economic inequality. His populist message resonated with the country's poor, who eventually helped bring him to power. The key moment in his presidency came in 2004, when oil prices surged. Venezuela's petroleum-dependent economy started booming, and Chavez went on to spend billions from the profits on...
So you notice that? You notice how they talked about how under Chavez the oil prices surged, with no mention of the fact that Chavez was traveling around to OPEC countries to get them to stabilize the price of oil so that Venezuela couldn't be choked off by the U.S. They don't give Chavez credit for that, right? They say, the oil prices randomly spiked up and he invested it in social welfare programs. Well, in 2002, the U.S. tried to do a coup. They're leaving that out. Then Chavez renationalized the oil industry, firing thousands of pro-Western executives who were helping funnel Venezuela's oil revenue to the West. Then he reinvested that money in social programs. Then he traveled around to different OPEC countries to stabilize the price of oil. And they didn't mention the price of oil when they were talking about Maduro, right? The election of Chavez and the successes of Chavez were due to global oil prices. But the failures of Maduro and the failures and the poverty of current Venezuela have nothing to do with that. They can simply be put on the election of Maduro. Notice the exact opposite telling of history they give for the country when it's experienced stagflation and 99% decrease in their government revenue versus how they explain the country under Chavez when things were good and people were being pulled out of poverty. The successes of Chavez are due to global oil prices, but the failures of Maduro are due to Maduro, and let's ignore global oil prices. Very, very typical way that liberal corporate media lies about these countries and gives a biased narrative without letting people who aren't super politically aware know that they're giving a biased narrative.
Social welfare programs for the poor. He subsidized food, improved the educational system, built an enviable healthcare system, and reduced poverty by more than half. These programs certainly helped the poor, but they served a purpose for Chavez as well. In order to be reelected, he needed to keep these millions of poor Venezuelans happy.
And heaven forbid, right? Heaven forbid a leader actually has to keep their poor people happy, right? What a dictator. He had to keep the poor people happy. In the U.S., you just keep the rich people happy so they keep funding your campaign. And that's what democracy is all about, baby.
So he rigged the economy to do just that. He didn't scale back Venezuela's dependence on oil, and his unrestrained spending led to a growing deficit.
He rigged the economy to help poor people. He rigged the economy to help poor people. Corruption is when the economy helps poor people. This is Western media, everybody. Holy cow, how did they say that with a straight face? Disgusting.
Which meant all of these programs would be impossible to sustain if oil prices fell. After Chavez's death, when Maduro took office as his handpicked successor, that's exactly what happened. Oil prices plummeted in 2014, and Maduro failed to adjust. Hyperinflation has made medicines and food that were once subsidized unaffordable for Venezuelans poor.
Again, no mention of the bank blocking Venezuelan vaccine in Scandinavia, right? They talk about how medical supplies have gone down, and what they say is that the United States does not block medicine, right? Our blockade doesn't block medicine. Our sanctions are humanitarian. But what they do is Venezuela has made all but the last little bit of a payment for the COVID vaccine to a Scandinavian bank, and the Scandinavian bank, at the behest of the United States, has been blocking that payment from going through, so Venezuela can't receive the vaccine. So this is how countries starve Venezuela and starve Cuba of things like medicine and food that the U.S. claims they're not blocking with the blockade. Now, recently, Scandinavia said, forget the U.S., forget the blockade, we are going to allow this payment to go through. And you see here the payment for COVAX was received, and this was an example of these Scandinavian countries kind of saying, forget the U.S. For once, which is a good sign. But this is how the U.S. and Western capitalists work together to block countries from getting things like medicine and food that they can use to feed their people in an attempt to promote color revolution, while also funneling $52 million into the right-wing parties like we talked about earlier.
Who now make up about 82% of the population. Like Chavez, Maduro has also rigged the economy to keep himself in power, but this time it's not benefiting the poor. He's exploited a complex currency system put in place by Chavez. Maduro set the official exchange rate at 10 bolivars per US dollar, but only his friends and allies have access to this rate. In reality, the Venezuelan currency has become basically worthless. Most Venezuelans get their dollars on the black market, where the rate is about 12,000 bolivars per dollar.
This is another thing I go in depth on as far as the thesis, my Venezuela thesis that you can check out on Midwestern Marx. But this is what I predicted they would use as an argument earlier, right? They use this dual currency thing to kind of explain it without actually explaining how it works, right? They just expect that people don't really understand economics or what a dual currency even means, and they say, oh, Maduro gave his cronies a special currency. But this was a way that Chavez created and that Maduro extrapolated on to try and get around the blockade, to try and tie the Venezuelan currency to oil rather than leaving them dependent on the petrodollar, because all global currency is all global oil is traded in the U.S. currency, in the U.S. dollar, so that gives them special control over the oil industry so they can do things like plummet Venezuela's economy. So there was a way of trying to get around that, and it's essentially the how corporate media outlets portray Venezuela. They say as soon as this currency scheme was invented, that's when the economy went down the tubes, without mentioning that the scheme was only invented to try and get around the petrodollar and the sanction regime.
Military, which got complete control of the food supply from Maduro in 2016, is reportedly profiting off this currency crisis. They import food at Maduro's special currency rate and sell it on the black market for a massive profit. So for military generals and political...
So that's actually true. Venezuela will set price ceilings on countries, on specific commodities, on goods. They'll say you can't sell food for more than this amount, right? Because we need to make sure that everybody gets food. And then private producers will take their food and then they'll go across the border to Colombia and sell the food at a higher price in Colombia where there's no price ceiling. So you see corruption in the form of capitalism, and especially capitalism in Colombia, where the U.S. has tons of military bases and has been funneling tons of money, and obviously the Colombian government are extremely right-wing and actually are authoritarian and very closely allied with the U.S. That capitalist neoliberal economy is where private producers in Venezuela will go and sell their goods to try and maximize profit. So it's not socialist corruption, it's capitalist corruption that is eroding the country, that they try and put off here as somehow being the fault of Maduro and the Venezuelan government.
allies of Maduro, the crisis has offered a lucrative opportunity which has helped Maduro stay in power. But he can't rely on that support alone. Which brings us back to Maduro's recent power grab. The opposition boycotted the vote, but Maduro held the vote for a new constitutional assembly anyway, and won a majority.
What? Are they serious? Did anyone hear that? They said Maduro's power grab. The Venezuelan opposition party refused to run for National Assembly election, but he held an election anyways. Holding an election is a power grab? How can you say that out loud with not realizing how ridiculous it sounds? Liberals, man. Liberals.
Protests on the streets of Venezuela turning deadly after President Nicolas Maduro declares victory.
The violence on Sunday, very real. The bomb went off near some motorcycle police, wounding several.
Election day clashes between protesters and police claiming at least 10 more lives.
At least.
So this is kind of what I was talking about with that Abby Martin video, and everyone should go watch it. Abby Martin spends time with the Venezuelan protesters on the ground in Venezuela. You see the violence that came here. The opposition boycotted the election. Maduro held an election anyways and won, and then they just start committing acts of violence to try and make it look like there's mass protests and make it look like the Venezuelan government is cracking down on these protests to make it look like the election wasn't legitimate. And one of their points of evidence for the election being legitimate is that the opposition boycotted, but Maduro still held an election. Holding an election is more democracy, not less democracy, just because the opposition knew that they couldn't win, so they decided not to run and then did violent terrorist acts the next day to try and promote or to try and make it look like the Venezuelan government was cracking down on them, is not less democracy. That is not authoritarian. That is a right-wing party who gets millions of dollars from the CIA committing terrorist acts to try and create regime change and create destabilization in their country because they don't like socialism.
Election day clashes between protesters and police claiming at least 10 more lives.
At least one candidate has been murdered, shot to death.
La elección de la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente es un fraude abierto, el mundo lo ve, lo ha visto, está claro, todos están claros de lo que sucedió. Ahora, lo que hay que seguir es seguir buscando la libertad, porque nosotros vivimos en libertad y sabemos lo que es eso.
Just as I was talking about with the other protesters. Just as I was talking about with the other protesters, and just as Second Thought was talking in his video about Cuba. Words like freedom that don't mean anything. What did I say? These people aren't even demanding anything. What does he say? We know what we want. We lived with freedom and we know what it is. Okay, what is it then? What exactly do you want from the government other than for it to be toppled? They'll never say it, right? All they'll say is we need the government to be toppled because they're authoritarian and we want freedom. What does that mean? We know what it is. Okay, well then explain it. What is it, right-wing Venezuelan protester being interviewed by a corporate media outlet? Please tell me what you want to do with the Venezuelan government besides topple it and hand their oil to Western multinationals who can make insane profits. Because it seems like that's all you want to do.
Ya vamos ahí. Lo que sucedió ayer fue el más grande fraude que se haya cometido en cualquier elección nacional. Era un fraude cantado, ya se sabía que iba a ser una elección con poca asistencia, pero con una gran participación forzada.
Participation forced by the government? They're accusing Venezuela of forcing their people to vote, and they're saying that is authoritarian, for forcing them to vote in an election. What is not authoritarian? How is voting in an election not authoritarian? And this guy admits, he says the opposition boycotted, so we know turnout would be low. Yet this is still a fraud. Well, why did the opposition boycott then? It seems like y'all were just trying to make the turnout seem low so you could claim it was a fraud and that Maduro was running the elections from behind the scenes with no evidence. That's kind of what it seems like, and that's what all the Venezuelan analysis reporting on the ground said with the Venezuelan elections. I just want to bring this up so people realize how much of a fraud it is, this idea that that the elections in Venezuela are just run by Maduro. As we said, the right-wing opposition party recently won, so some rigged elections there that allows the opposition party to win. But as this Venezuela analysis article goes into detail about, the turnout is low because, as that guy said, the opposition purposefully boycotts certain elections, says, look, the turnout is low because Maduro was stopping us from participating in the elections, even though we boycotted, somehow that makes sense, and therefore he's a dictator, and that's why we're having these violent protests, and that's why the U.S. needs to intervene and do a regime change. Same thing every single time Venezuela has an election.
Maduro's government is trying to create the illusion of public support. The government claimed about 8 million people, or 40% of the country, voted, but experts put that number much lower, at just 3 million people.
And by experts, what they've started doing now at Venezuela Analysis is they had like 140 different non-governmental groups monitoring their last election. So they get so many different groups monitoring the election in now that they try and make it overwhelming. And then what the U.S. does is have the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is a State Department regime change arm that exists in Latin America that has been used to propagate coups and color revolutions against all sorts of socialist governments in Latin America at the behest of the U.S. They announced that the elections were fraudulent, and then all of Western media picks that up and they say, oh, the OAS said this, and it's a government organization. It sounds really believable, it sounds really legit, and people buy it, even though you might have 140 different organizations on the ground saying the elections were legit, and this one organization, the OAS, which is Western backed and backed by the right-wing forces within Latin America, come out and say the election was fraudulent. And because corporate media outlets like Vox have millions of dollars to blast that nonsense to the American public, that's what happens, and that's what the public ends up believing.
The international community, including Peru, Canada, Spain, Mexico, and Argentina, condemned the election. The U.S. imposed financial sanctions on Maduro and members of his government.
The international community, they say. And by that, they mean Western countries who are loyal to the United States.
But Maduro's assembly, filled with loyalists, convened anyway, and it swiftly removed Attorney General Luis Ortega, leader of the opposition. Armed groups reportedly arrested several other opposition leaders too. Whether the group will rewrite the Constitution or postpone the next presidential election remains to be seen. For now, Maduro has unprecedented power.
They didn't boycott the next presidential election. They didn't stop the next presidential election. The government did it. You want to know what happened? The opposition boycotted the election, turnout was low, Maduro won easily, and then they said the elections were fraudulent and the U.S. tried another regime change attempt. The exact same thing that happened in these elections after this video was made happened in the most recent elections. So these guys at Vox are like, oh, we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, we do. The U.S. is going to try, or the opposition's going to boycott. They're going to have low turnout. They're going to say it's because the elections are fraudulent that we have low turnout, even though we're boycotting. Somehow that makes sense. And then they're going to try and do regime change, and the U.S. corporate media is going to blast over the airwaves how authoritarian Venezuela's government's going to be. What do you mean we don't know what's going to happen in the next election? Every election in Venezuela goes the same way since 1998. The Socialist Party wins because the people know, well, the one time the Conservative Party won National Assembly election, but almost always the Socialist Party wins. The right-wing party funded by the CIA claims fraud, and then the U.S. corporate media tries to propagate regime change in Venezuela. We know exactly how it goes. Y'all do the same thing every time. You're so predictable.
Over a country that continues to spiral out of control.
Esto está cada día peor, mi querido. Si este hombre no se va, aquí Venezuela, bueno, ya. Una guerra aquí. Aquí lo que hay es guerra, una guerra.
War. What we have is war if this man doesn't leave Venezuela, right? Again, nothing specific. No specific complaints other than that he doesn't have freedom. And if he doesn't leave, we want war. Even if that means the U.S. sending in ships and sending in their military to overthrow and destabilize our country. You know, if that's what it takes to get this one guy out of power, then that's what we'll do. But yeah, because that has worked so well in the history of Latin American countries. All right, so that's a great example of how the propaganda with Venezuela works. Obviously, I was kind of able to break it down piece by piece there. Most of the propaganda points that they used I was pretty used to dealing with or talked about in my thesis because they're the same every time, right? The U.S. corporate media is so lazy in their propaganda. The things the CIA does to foment color revolution and to funnel money into like opposition things like Guaido in Venezuela or opposition parties like Guaido in Venezuela, they're sneaky with that. They're tactical with that. They're good at that. But the lies that the corporate media makes up to try and get people to support overthrowing these countries are so lazy. It is ridiculous. And anybody who looks at the country in any kind of depth, not even from a socialist perspective, but just trying to find the truth, will see how ridiculous this narrative is from